In the nation's capital, across the country, the mood was sorrowful, patriotic, and reflective of those affected by the tragedy.
President Bush spent an emotional Friday leading the nation in prayer in Washington and rallying work crews at the heart of the rubble in New York. CNN senior White House correspondent John King recaps Mr. Bush's Friday and looks at the tough decisions that lie ahead of him.
A first-hand look at the worst of the devastation and a pep talk that included a promise to those pulling the dead from the rubble.
I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
After his emotional tour of New York, Mr. Bush was asked if he knew who was responsible.
We know we got a suspect.
But lead suspect Osama bin Laden is an elusive target, and aides say one of the president's greatest challenges is convincing an angry nation to be patient.
This conflict was begun on the timing and terms of others. It will end in a way and at an hour of our choosing.
Mr. Bush declared a national emergency and authorized a call-up of the National Guard and reservists. And Congress passed a resolution authorizing the president to use all necessary and appropriate force to retaliate. Senior officials say they do not rule out a first wave of military strikes in the near future. But Mr. Bush is asking his national security team and other world leaders to develop a long-range plan. For example, sources tell CNN the president is asking the leaders of Canada, France, Germany, Britain, and other nations to do more to break up terrorist cells in their countries, and asking Saudi Arabia and other moderate Arab nations to crack down on bin Laden's financial supporters and to take a tougher line with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
In our response, we will have to take into account not only the perpetrators, but those who provide haven, support, inspiration, financial, and other assets to the perpetrators.
Mr. Bush also led the nation in a day of prayer and remembrance, with former presidents, the cabinet, and the Congress joining in.
Grief and tragedy and hatred are only for a time. Goodness, remembrance, and love have no end. And the Lord of life holds all who die and all who mourn.
Consoling the nation is another role for a president at times of crisis, and a father who knows the strains of the job well gave his son a supportive tap. Administration sources say weekend national security meetings will focus on options for responding, and senior officials tell CNN they enter those talks with one encouraging development. Pakistan, which borders Afghanistan, has now promised to fully cooperate in any U.S. operations. John King, CNN, the White House.
Armed with congressional authorization to use force, Washington is preparing its warriors. President Bush has given the Defense Department the go-ahead to call up to 50,000 National Guardsmen and reservists. Administration officials say the primary role of the troops to supplement recovery and domestic security efforts. Military planners have identified an initial allotment of 35,500 reservists from the various services. 10,000 of them would come from the Army, 13,000 from the Air Force. The Marines would provide 7,500, the Navy and Coast Guard 3,000 and 2,000 respectively. The Congress passed that joint resolution Friday authorizing the president to counter force with force. We go now to Major Garrett in Washington with more on the story. Major?
Jonathan, a significant act by the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, with only one negative vote, and the Senate, voting unanimously in favor of a joint resolution authorizing the use of force. And the wording of that congressional resolution, very significant. Let me put forward to you a key passage. The President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons. Why is that significant? Well, in the President's address to the nation on the night of the attack on Tuesday, September 11th, he said the United States would no longer draw a distinction between terrorists and those who harbor them. No one in the White House is calling that a Bush doctrine, but it is clearly a shift in U.S. policy, one now the Congress has completely and thoroughly and legally endorsed, giving the president now full constitutional and legal authority to prosecute a war not just against those the United States deems responsible directly for the acts of terror committed in the United States on September 11th, but the nations that also harbored those terrorists or terrorist cells. A key shift in U.S. policy, one now that has the full backing legally of the United States Congress. Jonathan?
Major, one vote against the resolution. Who was it, and why did they vote that way?
Barbara Lee, a Democrat from California. That Democrat, Barbara Lee, told reporters afterward that she was afraid of granting the president too much authority to prosecute this, what he calls the new and first war of the 21st century. She was not alone in that general sentiment, although she was alone when the final vote tally was taken. Many members of Congress were a bit reluctant to grant what they might have considered too broad authority to the president to prosecute this war. And in fact, there were some rather heated negotiations between the White House and Congress about language that would have given the president this type of authority to deal with any future terrorist attack. The Congress decided ultimately not to grant what they considered in that case open-ended authority to prosecute a war against actions that had not yet occurred, and gave the president the authority to deal with this particular and specific attack against the United States on September 11th. The White House decided ultimately that was good enough, but there was a good deal of negotiation, some of it heated, about even broader authority for the president, but in the end, a unanimous or very near unanimous endorsement from the Congress for these broad presidential powers to react to the tragic, murderous events of September 11th. Jonathan.
Major Garrett in Washington, thanks very much. Zane?
Thanks, John. Osama bin Laden, the man some Bush administration officials describe as the prime suspect, has long been at the top of the U.S. list of major sponsors of terrorism. Andrea Koppel looks at how far-reaching the U.S. response might be if bin Laden's the target.
If, as the U.S. suggests, Osama bin Laden was the mastermind behind Tuesday's attacks, going after him and shutting down his al-Qaeda terrorist network will require more than just a military assault on Afghanistan. That's because over the years, al-Qaeda has become an international network with cells rooted in almost every region of the world. That's why Secretary of State Colin Powell has put the world on notice. The United States needs help.
I am not threatening so much as I am saying this has become a new benchmark, a new way of measuring the relationship and what we can do together in the future.
Since Tuesday, Powell has had the world on speed dial, in particular reaching out to countries where the U.S. says Islamic militant groups have links to bin Laden's network.
Once these people have been trained in Afghanistan, we know that they've gone to Africa, we know that they've gone to Asia, we know that they've gone back to the Middle East, and it's clear now that they've also come to the United States.
People like Ahmed Rassam, the man charged with attempting to bomb the United States over the millennium. He's a member of Algeria's armed Islamic group, but was trained by bin Laden. So were members of Pakistan's Harak-ul-Mujahideen group, which hijacked an Indian jetliner to Afghanistan in December 1999. On Friday, Pakistan's president informed the U.S. his country is prepared to take specific steps to help the U.S. wage its campaign against bin Laden. And in the Arab world, Powell has asked countries like Saudi Arabia to cut off the flow of money and resources to bin Laden. For Secretary Powell, who led Allied troops to victory in the Gulf War, this war against terrorists will be fought on an entirely different battlefield.
And so you have to design a campaign plan that goes after that kind of enemy. And it isn't always blunt force military, although that is certainly an option.
But diplomatic sources say whatever option the U.S. chooses to take, it will need the support of Islamic countries. Such support would send a strong message to bin Laden and his Islamic extremist supporters around the world. They have nowhere to hide. Andrea Koppel, CNN, at the State Department.
Officials across the United States are urging citizens not to vent their frustration on Muslims and Arab Americans. Still, there have been threats and attacks. Hundreds of members of the Los Angeles Muslim community gathered for Friday prayer amid a large police and FBI presence. Muslims across the U.S. are finding themselves targets of threats, harassment, and abuse.
Islam and terrorism are completely separate. Islam has nothing to do with terrorism.
Jonathan Aiken has more now on how the Muslim community in the United States is being affected.
In mosques and community centers like this one, Muslims added their voices to Friday's national chorus.
We are able to, participate in the National Day of Prayer as well, but this is our day of prayer.
These prayers in suburban Virginia were mixed with an effort to raise money for victims and their families. Charity is a tenet of the faith. There's also been a concerted effort to speak to a much broader congregation, to the nation at large, to make the point that what happened this week in New York and Washington was done in a moral vacuum and doesn't truly represent Islam.
Once a Muslim commits murder against an innocent life, he's outside the bounds of Islam. He cannot be considered a Muslim.
And that's a major point American Muslims want to make, given the vandalism and threats of violence that have been directed towards them. Those fears kept most women and children away from prayer services in some places Friday and have dominated conversations between parents and children.
I have to explain to them on the one hand that somebody did something wrong and somebody did something very hurtful to a lot of people. And then I have to say that the person that did it was not acting as a Muslim, and I have to be very clear about that.
The pictures from New York and Washington don't help as American Muslims try to convince their fellow citizens that a faith based on humility and social justice is not a threat to the American way of life. Jonathan Aiken for CNN, Sterling, Virginia.
Muslims in Great Britain have strongly condemned Tuesday's terrorist attacks, and Prime Minister Tony Blair has offered his thanks to the Muslim community. Iqbal Sakrani of the Muslim Council of Britain joins us now from London. Sir, is the backlash against the Muslim community that we're seeing in the United States, there have been some incidents, is that a knee-jerk reaction, or could there be some serious long-term implications?
Well, if the way the media has been reporting over the last few days, if this rather wild speculation continues, then sadly the Muslim community in the UK, in Europe and in other parts of the world will suffer from this rather a tragic event that has taken place in the States.
So what do you do?
Well, now the situation is very clear. I think greater responsibility on our reporting has to come in. There is a clear unanimous view prevailing within the Muslim community of utter condemnation to these people who have committed this atrocious crime. And we need to identify individuals, groups who are responsible, the perpetrators of this crime, against the entire community. At present, they are suspects, there are people detained. There is no guilt that has been pronounced of persons responsible. And I think we have to exercise caution and calm as we go along. Rushing into this judgment, this knee-jerk reaction of blemishing or castigating the entire community, we are exacerbating the already dangerous situation that we are facing at the moment.
When we look at a bigger picture here as well, some analysts also say that the onus is on Muslim countries, on Muslim leaders also to contain the extremist elements within their countries and make sure people understand that there's that distinction between the two. Your response?
We are all responsible to that. I mean, we all have responsibility to ensure that the present crisis that we are all facing is looked in an objective manner. But also we have to look at the root problem. Why do we see this situation occurring? Why has this sort of attempt, such a serious evil attempt been made at the innocent lives in America? If we do not look at the root cause and simply come to reacting and into our minds that the culprits can only be these extreme Muslim groups, then I think the long-term problem is still there. We need to examine the American foreign policy, the situation that we have in Palestine, the situation that is prevailing in Iraq, where daily hundreds of innocent children are dying. Now, we know the problems that have arisen, the culprit who are the real culprits, but we never get rid of the culprits.